Hi, I'm Jillian. Thank you for watching. Observation as a method for collecting qualitative data entails spending time in natural or native settings known as the field with the subject of interest or where the object of interest unfolds and is expressed. What researchers see, hear, feel, touch, smell, and otherwise experience in accordance with their research questions is carefully recorded as field notes. This process, although very enjoyable, is time-consuming for researchers and often inconvenient for research participants. So researchers strive to be as efficient in collecting as much relevant data as possible. This requires careful and practical planning as well as flexibility. In this video, I outline the many choices, decisions, and judgments to be made and what I take into consideration when using the observation method. Some context. Much of my experience is with case study and microethnographic methodologies, for which observation is one of several methods of data collection. Further, my research is in the area of moral education and the moral dimensions of K-12 schooling. So the examples I offer are meant to be illustrative, not defining. The setting or settings in which observation takes place and the timing of observation sessions is determined by the scope of the study and its purpose and questions. For example, if my question asks how children's playground activities are monitored and influenced by teachers at a particular school, observation will take place on that school's playground at lunch, recess, and before and after school. If my study aims to explore how secondary school administrators in a particular school board communicate policy to teachers and staff, observation will take place in the meeting rooms, staff rooms, and offices of several secondary schools within that board. And if my question asks how a particular teacher delivers math curricula, observation will take place in the teacher's classroom during math lessons. While settings and timing are usually embedded in the research question, practical considerations such as funding, feasibility, and resources will influence more specific choices that researchers make. For example, the number of participants and settings, and how many observation sessions for each participant and setting. A tip. Sometimes the setting is selected before the research question is fully formed. Regardless of what comes first, ensure there is consistency between the setting and question so that the setting yields ample data to address the question. Another tip, if possible, repeat or duplicate observation settings to deepen your understanding and enrich your data. Access to the setting during the desired times is subject to approval by participants and, where applicable, other stakeholders. The researcher must be clear on boundaries and limitations. For example, I usually have full access to classroom activities, but can't observe interactions between teachers and parents. If students are sent to the office for disciplinary reasons, I can't follow them. Sometimes I can attend field trips and sometimes I can't. If you are conducting a multiple case study, it might be important to have consistency across all participants regarding observations. Therefore, what you negotiate with one participant is negotiated with all. Finally, while researchers do their best to anticipate observation settings and times prior to the start of fieldwork, they can change as the study progresses. For example, a previously unrecognized setting might become relevant. The selected setting might stop yielding relevant data. You might lose access to a setting, or the participant's schedule might change. In my experience, most changes can be accommodated by the participant and researcher. During observation, researchers can engage in the setting to greater or lesser degrees and with different data outcomes. Imagine a spectrum of options from complete detachment to full engagement. Complete detachment means researchers do not engage with people or activities in the setting. They remain separate and on the fringes. This is called non-participant observation. Such an observer might sit or stand in a single spot or move around the spaces of the setting, sitting or standing in different spots. Sitting in a single spot is the least obtrusive, intrusive, and disruptive. Participants may forget that the researcher is even there, and they may be their most natural, authentic selves. Recording data is also easier from a single spot. Different spots, however, might offer different perspectives. For example, a researcher might see or hear something on one side of the room that cannot be seen or heard from the other, but moving around may draw attention to the researcher. Complete detachment as a non-participant observer, whether in a single spot or multiple spots, offers the most objective perspective and etic or outsider viewpoint. Alternatively, researchers may choose to fully engage in the research setting such that they are integral to it, as in action research methodology. This offers a subjective perspective or emic or insider viewpoint, including, for example, how activities and social dynamics are experienced by those in the setting. But because the researcher cannot disengage from the setting without it being significantly altered, an objective perspective and etic viewpoint are not possible. And recording in the moment observation notes is more challenging simply because the researcher is busy with other things. Data, therefore, are mostly after the fact recollections that rely on memory. To gain degrees of outsider and insider perspectives and etic and emic viewpoints, and to minimize the limitations of each, a researcher may assume the role of observer as participant or participant as observer, with less to more engagement in the field, respectively. The balance between observing and participating is often a dynamic one, ebbing and flowing over the course of a study, particularly if that study is long. I usually begin as a non-participant observer, perched in a single spot at the back of the classroom, gaining an objective perspective and etic viewpoint. When the data I'm collecting in this way maxes out, I begin to wander around and sit in different places, including, for example, the teacher's desk, the reading chair, the carpet, and student tables. Eventually, and with approval from the teacher, I participate by assisting students with seat work, reading to them, and leading them to the library, the music room, and the gym. These experiences enable me to more deeply appreciate the teacher's challenges in juggling several tasks and simultaneously meeting a range of student needs. While my level of participation varies moment to moment and day to day, I remain observer as participant and do not become participant as observer. For example, I never teach a lesson or have the responsibility of managing the class, but you might design a study where you do. Another tip: participating in the research setting can be helpful to participants and a good way to thank them for being part of your study. Just make sure this does not compromise your ability to collect data. Observation data is recorded as field notes, literally notes you record while in the field. Field notes are mainly in the form of words, but can also be drawings, maps, diagrams, graphs, flowcharts, and other schematics. Maps, for example, are useful to represent the orientation of physical spaces, diagrams to represent social dynamics and relationships, and flowcharts and mind maps to represent emerging themes and connections between data points. These can be handwritten, digital, or oral. I record both by hand in a notebook or journal and digitally in a laptop computer or tablet. This allows me to capitalize on the advantages and minimize the disadvantages of each. For example, writing by hand is slower for me and limits my ability to record dialogue, but it allows me to move easily through the spaces of the setting. Digital note-taking allows me to capture dialogue and more in-the-moment detail, but I need to be stationary to do so. I do not dictate notes orally because it is more disruptive and introduces issues of privacy regarding ambient sounds and voices. However, you might not be concerned about that in your study. What a researcher pays attention to while observing and the resulting data that is recorded depends on the research question. In ethnographies, the question is very broad, often, what is going on here? So ethnographers attempt to write notes on almost everything in the setting. In case studies, the focus is narrower, based on particular phenomenon of interest. Researchers nonetheless see and hear everything. So knowing what to record as data involves using good judgment. For example, if a study is interested in how teachers deliver curricula, the researcher likely won't record the academic progress of individual students, even though that might be apparent. Sometimes the researcher might not know right away if an observation is relevant. In these cases, err on the side of recording. Field notes are not usually shared with participants as per the letter of information and consent, so they will not cause harm or embarrassment. Tip: when in doubt, record observations now and judge their relevance regarding the research question later. I always record contextual data as well, even if that data seems silly or becomes irrelevant in analysis. In one study, for example, I recorded that the windows were closed until lunch and then opened for the rest of the afternoon, that music was played from 8:30 to 8:55 a.m. and then again from 3:20 to 3:45 p.m., that the south wall contained a calendar but nothing had been written in it, and that the teacher's school wardrobe was mostly black, white, and gray. It's difficult to recall such detail with authenticity after leaving the field, and they can add depth and clarity to other data. Two more tips. Think of yourself as a very curious detective, uncovering clues and following leads. Second, be open to unanticipated and unexpected observations that can lead to new meanings and insights. Finally, I include as field notes materials that I have permission to collect, including documents, audio recordings, video recordings, and photographs. In my studies, these are usually considered supplementary data that support and deepen observational and interview data. But depending on the study's purpose and research questions, document analysis can be a methodology on its own or its own method of data collection and analysis. Tip: review your field notes after each observation session while your memory is fresh. Add details that you didn't or couldn't record well in the field. There are generally three types of data that a researcher will record during observation: objective descriptive data, subjective descriptive data, and reflective data. Objective descriptive data represent observations that everyone and anyone might readily perceive in the same way. Here are some examples. To collect objective descriptive data, consider questions that begin with the words what, who, when, and where. So, for example, what does it look, smell, taste, feel, sound like? What is done and said and by whom? Where and when does this take place? Who's there and who's not there? Who's participating and who's observing? What started and ended this? What happened after? What is the orientation of the furniture in the room? What items are on the walls and on the counters? Objective descriptive data are often recorded in the form of words, drawings, maps, and diagrams. Subjective descriptive data require judgment, evaluation, interpretation, and opinion, such that there will likely be variation among different researchers observing the same settings according to their unique personal and professional experiences, backgrounds, and abilities. Here are some examples related to the types of studies I conduct. When recording descriptive data of a subjective nature, also record answers to the following questions. How do I know this? Why do I come to this conclusion? What evidence is there to support it? Your answers to these questions, along with transparency on any personally held biases, assumptions, and beliefs that may contribute to your subjective thoughts, increase the trustworthiness of your study. Subjective descriptive data are mostly recorded in the form of words, but some may also be represented in diagrams. Finally, reflective data include the researcher's opinions, intuitions, suppositions, hunches, speculations, rudimentary interpretations and analysis, and reflexive or self-reflecting thoughts. It is highly unlikely, therefore, for different researchers to record the same reflective data. Here are examples of reflective data. To support and substantiate reflective data, researchers offer copious amounts of descriptive data, both objective and subjective. Reflective data are mostly recorded in the form of words, but some may also be represented in charts and schematics. These three types of data are layered onto each other to generate deep understanding and insight. Here's an example of how this works. I'll let you pause the video to read. There are two levels of ethical considerations for the observation method. The first is general research ethics, which apply to all methods and include informed consent, confidentiality and privacy, the right of participants to withdraw or refuse to grant access to particular activities, and the protection and security of field notes, among others. You can find plenty of resources on this. The second is relationship ethics, Relationship ethics speaks to the importance of earning participants' trust and respect. Without both, they are unlikely to relax and be natural with you around, which can compromise the authenticity and quality of data. And they are less likely to be flexible in providing access to settings and accommodating requests for modifications. Finding ways to express the following moral values and others you may think of will help gain trust and respect. Humility. You are there to learn from participants because they know or do something that you do not or cannot. In other words, they are the experts, not you. Find a way to communicate this to them. Consideration. The setting and the people within it are not there for you. They were there before you arrived, and they will carry on after you leave. You are simply a guest passing through, so be a good guest. Empathy. You will witness all kinds of things. Some you may like, some you may not like. Before passing judgment and applying your biases and assumptions, try to understand what you are observing through the eyes of those who operate in the setting. Gratitude. While some participants enjoy having researchers around, they have relatively little to gain from your presence or your study. So find ways to show your appreciation. For example, with a note, a gift card, or by volunteering your time. Fairness. Participants have a job to do beyond participating in your study, and that job is their top priority. Make sure your expectations of them are reasonable and justifiable. And honesty and openness. Being observed can make participants feel vulnerable and cause them to be suspicious of your intentions. Do not misrepresent who you are and where your interests lie. Share what you can about yourself and the study to ease their minds. A tip: stay off your phone during observation sessions. Not appearing fully engaged can be interpreted as disrespectful and insensitive and can undermine efforts to earn trust and respect. Every research method has limitations that researchers should acknowledge, understand, and where possible, mediate. Two limitations are typical of observation. The first, known as researcher effect, relates to how the researcher's presence in the field can alter what is being observed. For example, if my goal is to observe how the teacher delivers a lesson, my presence during that lesson may cause the teacher to talk more, allot more time than usual to instruction, draw on additional resources, and/or take more or fewer student questions. So I may not be seeing a typical lesson. Researcher effect can be mediated by prolonged engagement in the field, which enables participants to become accustomed to the researcher such that they may even forget the researcher is there and/or simply give up trying to manage the researcher's impressions. Researcher effect can also be mediated by using additional methods of data collection, such as interviews and document analysis. For example, I might ask in an interview how lessons typically unfold, and I may collect the teacher's lesson plans to supplement observations. The second limitation is subjectivity. All data is collected, recorded, and interpreted through the researcher's lens, worldviews, and perspectives, which are influenced by their biases and assumptions. While it's generally understood and accepted that qualitative research is subjective by nature, the level of subjectivity is mediated by collecting copious amounts of detailed data, including data from other methods, and by researchers' transparency regarding assumptions, beliefs, and experiences as they impact the choices, decisions, and interpretations they make. Your particular study might have additional limitations related to, for example, restricted scheduling of observation sessions, settings you could not access, or supporting documents that were not made available. All of these choices, decisions, judgments, and considerations shape the observation protocol, which is a document detailing in a practical way how the observation sessions will be conducted. The protocol should be explicit so that others can use it to conduct their own observations. This is particularly helpful for a team of researchers working in parallel, as well as a single researcher conducting similar observations with several participants. It also holds the researcher accountable to the study and maintains its rigor and trustworthiness. Accordingly, the protocol is included as an appendix in theses and dissertations and is summarized in the letter of information and consent, which is provided to participants. The rationale and theory underpinning the protocol are usually offered in the methodology chapter or section, neither of which is covered in this video. While the protocol is drafted as comprehensively as possible in anticipation of fieldwork, it can and should be updated with changes made on the fly. Strictly sticking to the protocol for the sake of doing so will not always yield the best data, particularly in qualitative research. So go ahead and make adjustments as needed. Just be sure to record them and justify them in order to provide an audit trail of your research process. In one of my protocols, for example, I added a note that as of a particular date, I no longer observed student-teacher conferences due to the teacher's concern for student privacy, and that all data previously collected in these sessions was deleted. Here is my final tip. Be honest about everything. After all, our studies are meant to be helpful, insightful, and instructive to others. The content of this video represents my own experiences as a qualitative researcher, coach, and instructor. Please share in the comments any tips, considerations, and ideas that you have.